Hello, I'm Tanya Zanish-Belcher, and I am honored to be speaking to you as SAA's 73rd President, and I would like to express my gratitude for having the opportunity to represent our organization this past year. This is my President's Address titled Keeping Evidence and Memory, Archive Storytelling in the 21st Century. 3 years ago, our SAA annual meeting theme was about telling the story of archives as part of President Kathleen Roe's Year of Living Dangerously. Recently, the term storytelling just kept popping up everywhere for me. I subscribe to the Brain Pickings newsletter, edited by Maria Popova, which has the literary arts as a focal point. While I often delete the messages, due to lack of time, I do save them if a subject catches my eye. And so while I was reading what I had set aside, the word storytelling appeared 3 times in conjunction with authors Iris Murdoch, Ursula K. Le Guin, and Susan Sontag. In the next day or so, the SAA annual meeting program came out, and I signed up to attend a Finding Aid to My Soul, an open mic storytelling session tonight. In May, I was interviewed for a blog post on diversity in archives created by Pass It Down, which advertises itself as a digital storytelling company. And finally, just last week, I was standing at the elevator and saw a Wake Forest flyer advertising the MA in Sports Storytelling program. Beyond simply telling our own archive stories, though, I realized the term can also be used in how we consider the documentary record. Archive storytelling is, in every way, dependent on recorded evidence and memory. Researchers use the records we collect to make sense of the past, present, and future. Through archives and their use, there is a cycle of storytelling with multiple characters and perspectives, different endings, and even never endings. As Murdoch observes, quote, "We are constantly employing language to make interesting forms out of experience, which perhaps originally seemed dull or incoherent," unquote. The making of sense belongs to the genealogists, researchers, scholars, and students who visit us or view our collections online. We can only hope that what we have acquired and collected can provide those interesting forms. We need to remember that, as Sontag points out, quote, "To tell a story is to say, this is the important story. It is to reduce the spread and simultaneity of everything to something linear, a path," unquote. This is why we collect about inadequately represented communities, create a documentation strategy, or interview and capture the stories of those who have been left out of the historical record. Wherever archivists focus their attention and effort can expand the number of stories told. Finally, Le Guin observed that, quote, "One of the functions of art, or I would say archives, is to give people the words to know their own experience. Storytelling is a tool for knowing who we are and what we want," unquote. However, how do we tell our story, the story of archivists? Who are we and what do we want? So here's a tale of what SAA, and when I say SAA, I mean all of us, has been working on over the past year. One of the primary ways we tell our story for archivists, users, and the records is through the practice of advocacy. Nothing could have prepared me for the onslaught of historical record issues for this past year or two, especially at the federal record level. Public records, including local and state records, truly are essential to the functioning of American democracy. In my years as SAA President and Vice President, we have created numerous issue briefs and position statements, signed letters and petitions, and responded to external requests representing crucial national records issues. The most recent relate to our support of the Presidential Records Act, concern over the illegal removal of Iraqi records from Iraq, and the nomination of Gina Haspel as director of the CIA, given her destruction of records documenting torture. We spoke about the importance of net neutrality, the use of private email by all governmental officials, the need for transparency in public records, the value and importance of the U.S. Census, and police mobile camera footage as a public record. For anyone interested in the labor-intensive and complex process by which these briefs and statements come to pass, please see my off-the-record blog post from July 16th. Earlier this week, SAA, along with COSA, NAGARA, and RAC, hosted a training day completely dedicated to congressional advocacy, where volunteers went to meet with congressional legislators and staffers. SAA has also collaborated with other related professional organizations, such as the American Historical Association, the National Humanities Alliance, and the National Coalition for History, an advocacy group which represents many in the history-related professions. This gives us additional flexibility when responding to issues of national importance. We also have continued our international advocacy work in a noteworthy meeting of the Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights of the World Intellectual Property Organization. SAA, represented by past President Bill Maher, and the Intellectual Property Working Group and other affiliated advocates took significant steps that place the needs of archives, libraries, and museums at the forefront of international conversations on intellectual property. An action plan will be presented soon, and SAA is working to collect archives examples which, quote, demonstrate how essential copyright exceptions are to the mission of archives, both in the United States and beyond, unquote, stated Maher in his most recent report to the SAA Council. Why does SAA dedicate its time to advocacy, and why is this important for us? Archivists play a special role in the preservation of the historical record, and in many cases the preservation and access of these records are dependent on our local, state, and federal governments. Awareness building also allows us to share who we are with the public and why records are integral to their lives. Through these efforts, we do our best to ensure that archival sources protect the rights of individuals and organizations, assure the continued accountability of governments and institutions based on evidence, and safeguard access to historical information and cultural heritage. Fostering diversity and inclusion within the profession continues to be a high priority for SAA. During our Portland meeting, we sponsored the Liberated Archive, a forum for envisioning and implementing a community-based approach to archives. The diversity program for this meeting, including multiple sessions and our diversity forum today featuring a panel discussion, is available in your on-site program. Fundraising for the Mosaic Scholarship and the Brenda S. Banks Travel Award continues, and our key partnership with the Association of Research Libraries in the IMLS-funded Mosaic Fellows Program will last 2 more years. The Task Force on Accessibility is updating our 2010 best practices for working with archives employees and users with physical disabilities, and is expanding them to include neurodisabilities, temporary disabilities, and others that may be in scope. A draft was shared earlier this week with Council, and member review will take place shortly. Our Tragedy Response Initiative Task Force was proposed by our Diverse Sexuality and Gender section, who were motivated by the Pulse nightclub tragedy, as well as far too many other incidents in the past few years. The task force will provide guidance regarding policies, procedures, and best practices for acquisition, deaccessioning, preservation, and access of memorial collections, and will also be considering the details of creating a permanent volunteer tragedy response team to assist communities. An update was provided in the Off the Record blog post on July 30th, and a final report will be submitted by 2020. Finally, sharing our expertise should be a priority. Last fall's events in Charlottesville point to the need for archivists to use our skills and experience to assist our communities in researching and determining the meaning and value of the names, images, and monuments in their midst, and whether what those symbols represent is historical truth or something else. In my first job at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, I learned to process and describe collections and to grapple with the enormity, complexity, and quite often, the awfulness of American history. As a transplanted Yankee, it didn't take me long to figure out the reason for the Confederate flag above the Capitol, or why the state holidays list included Confederate Memorial Day and Martin Luther King Jr./Robert E. Lee Day. Still, I understood too well why the street on which I was fortunate enough to attend the dedication of the Civil Rights Memorial at the Southern Poverty Law Center also hosted a Ku Klux Klan march several years later. This is not isolated to Alabama or even to one region of our country. The symbols of oppression and our violent past are all around us. The Council's Diversity and Inclusion Working Group priority this year has begun the process of creating a multifaceted diversity toolkit available online for archivists and anyone else who needs its resources. A bibliography for monuments and symbols of oppression is also available on the SAA website via the President's Off the Record blog post. This work is good, but more needs to be done. The implementation of equity and inclusion is not simply the purview of the Diversity Committee or our sections or even Council, but is a responsibility for all of us. The SAA Foundation is growing into a vital source for the funding of archives projects and research about the profession. Your donations are supporting this work, and the grants distributed by our National Disaster Recovery Fund for Archives. The Disaster Fund was expanded in 2017 to include eligibility for Mexico and non-U.S. Caribbean islands, and to award up to $5,000 in grant funding. As you can imagine, Hurricane Maria and the Mexican earthquake damaged many archival repositories. To date, the Foundation has awarded 9 grants to archivists and repositories in Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Mexico. We are grateful to our Latin American and Caribbean Cultural Heritage Archives section for translating the application materials. We have a growing role to play in the American Hemisphere, and it is important that we take that responsibility seriously. The Foundation also supported a new travel grants program for 2018 to provide grants of up to $1,000 each for travel to attend the SAA annual meeting. We received nearly 80 applications for 10 grants. Sustainable funding for professional development is an obvious problem for archivists, and so as I transition to the position of immediate past president and remain on the SAA Foundation board for at least one more year, one of my goals will be to explore how we can connect with external foundations and match their available funding and interest with our needs. Recently, SAA has undertaken two membership surveys, one focused on institutional support and professional development and the needs and interests of mid-career archivists. The results provided key data about what our members need for their success. I mentioned exploring foundation support for professional development, but we also obtained good information about what continuing education archivists would like to see SAA provide, courses on career planning, management, and leadership, among others. Your feedback in these surveys provide a path for SAA to follow over the next several years. This past year, SAA implemented a new CMS system, and over the next several years we'll be exploring its capabilities for SAA members. Having a robust infrastructure will allow for better connectivity among our members. You also play a role in the resources that SAA provides overall. How many people participate in SAA leadership? Although my unscientific count via the SAA website could include some duplication, as of the fall 2017, the total appeared to be approximately 631 archivists who are participating in SAA leadership activities. This doesn't count all the things other archivists do as part of SAA, whether authoring an article or essay for Archival Outlook, presenting at the annual meeting as part of the program or section programming, or sharing your opinion about our policies via the website. SAA members have recently reviewed the updated principles of the annual meeting, the Code of Ethics, best practices for internships as a component of a graduate archival program, and best practices for volunteers. Treat these as the opportunity they are for having your voice heard, and never feel hesitant to contact your elected officers and council. So these are only some of the SAA stories from the past year. Where should we go next? Here are some recommendations for SAA's future. These are only ideas for consideration. I realize that the term strategic planning is not one to raise excitement levels, but for an organization such as ours, a strategic plan is integral for our functioning as an organization representing multitudes, at this time 6,038 members and 526 institutions. As a reminder, the Society of American Archivists is committed to these core organizational values, which remind us of who we are and who we aspire to be. We advance the public standing of archivists. We ensure the diversity of its membership and leaders, the profession, and the archival record. We foster an open and inclusive culture of creativity, collaboration, and experimentation across the association. We provide excellent member service. We ensure transparency, accountability, integrity, professionalism, and social responsibility in conducting our activities. The more we remind ourselves of what we stand for and how we can integrate it into our everyday professional lives, the more successful as an organization we will be. Based on our strategic plan, what should SAA's top priorities be? While diversity and inclusion is a high priority for SAA, as I noted previously, I would like to see efforts be more broadly based, both in our organization and in our institutions. The diversity toolkit needs to be finalized, and we need members to create ideas and sources. If everyone watching this video submitted a recommendation, the toolkit would be a tremendous crowd-based resource for all. Please submit your ideas to president@archivists.org. We also need to explore new techniques and methodologies for collecting materials that better document underrepresented communities. Being strategic about this work is well worth our time, and incorporating it into our mission is key. While a portal library hosted by SAA for sharing policies and forms is still being discussed, what about a portal for collecting and sharing specific projects archivists have done to reconceive their collections to more truly be representational? Archivists also must work with communities and possibly develop a set of best practices to preserve their own materials outside of the archives. We can share advice, expertise, and supplies, ensuring that all boats, in this case the historical record, rise and are preserved. SAA has primarily focused its efforts on recruiting archivists who are members of marginalized communities and ensuring their participation in the organization and the profession. It is unclear how successful that effort has been, and although recruiting those new to archives is important, retaining them is even more so. We need to know what works, what are the specific obstacles being faced, and how we can expand efforts to overcome barriers. Much of the work relating to diversity, education, and even resources like best practices and webinars can help us reach and keep both these professionals and others in the field. In his 2016 President's Address, Dennis Meissner called for the creation of a task force on research, data, and evaluation. The task force, created last fall, presented some preliminary findings at the May Council meeting. I shared in a recent blog post and Archival Outlook column some of the questions I would like to see answered, and I've already added others to the list. What is the current breakdown in percentage of degrees held by archivists? 30 years ago, the predominant source of archives degree was history programs. In a census from 2004, the breakdown was 39.4% for the MLS/MLIS versus 46.3% for the MA, MS, MFA. It now appears that most archivists entering the field are coming from library school programs, but it would be good to have those numbers confirmed. However, there are still many people working as archivists who chose another path to this profession. How can archivists coming from different backgrounds, and in some cases philosophies, communicate and collaborate most effectively? How can our continuing education programs assist in fostering community among such a disparate group? How can we better collaborate with the graduate programs who funnel students into the profession? I have heard comments about the number of students and the perception that they are overwhelming a small job market. SAA has done many evaluations and reports which indicate we simply cannot afford the cost of an official accreditation process. So, it may be time to think creatively about what SAA can do. We can collect better documentation of every archives graduate programs and assess their strengths. We can host an annual forum as an invited opportunity for all archives programs to meet and discuss issues. We can organize a symposium as an opportunity for programs to deliberate major challenges and how to overcome them. We can increase the collection of better documentation of all archives graduate programs, an understanding of their strengths, and finally, we can explore collaborative assessment projects and institutional spotlights. As a profession, we also need more information about archivist salaries organized by location, type of degree, type of repository, and geographic location. These data would give us important information that would enhance our programming and advocacy efforts. Increasingly, job ads with no salaries are the norm. How can we encourage more transparency for the profession? The National Council on Public History and the American Association for State and Local History recently introduced policies that any job ads shared on their site must have salaries posted, and as with the American Library Association, it would be good for SAA to provide an average salary by state in order to strengthen archivists' negotiating power. Knowing more about the various subsets of SAA membership would also be helpful. As we try to collect more valid and useful data, as I mentioned previously, what has happened to the Mosaic Scholarship participants and Mosaic Fellows? Are they still in the profession, or have they moved on to other careers? Why? How effective is our mentoring program? Does our partnering structure work? How can we improve this experience? It is time to explore the ways we can truly examine our hiring and organizational practices. It is apparent that the archives profession has many economic issues. These range from how graduates find the programs they attend, the lack of underrepresented communities participating as archivists, the increasing number of students, the limited number of permanent positions, and the overwhelming prevalence of part-time and temporary positions. SAA members recently reviewed the best practices for internship and best practices for volunteers, with many good ideas for revisions. However, in addition to these best practices, I would suggest we proactively develop solutions for institutions to consider. Some possible ideas are investigating grant possibilities for the support either profession-wide or a consortium of institutions, much like our Mosaic program, to provide financial support for interns. Fundraising in your home institution to create endowments or expendable accounts to support interns, and SAA possibly providing some guidelines on how to make that happen. Hosting a symposium for graduate archives programs who require internships as part of their degree process to discuss these concerns further and develop ways to either provide support for interns, tuition remission, or provide the credit hours without cost to the student. Given that the task force may well recommend the creation of an SAA committee, I would therefore propose that the consideration of a subcommittee answering to the larger group be considered. This subcommittee would be specifically dedicated to economic equity and collect data about employment matters, including benefits, internships, salaries, how and when graduates enter entry-level positions, promotions, retirement, and broader work topics. Until we have the data and the ability to thoroughly analyze the results, it is difficult for SAA to respond in a substantive manner. To close this section of my talk, I want to say it will always be difficult for a large, complex organization to move nimbly and be flexible, given competing priorities and SAA's commitment to building consensus. I have been a member of SAA for nearly 30 years, and the differences between the SAA of the 1990s and the current day is difficult to even articulate because so much has changed. The key concepts that come to my mind when comparing them is today's emphasis on responsiveness to members, transparency in our actions, and a growing inclusiveness. Does SAA always get it right? Of course not. However, I would argue that SAA succeeds more often than it fails, and I would like to believe that we are an organization that learns from its mistakes to do things better the next time. Much like democracy, SAA is us, after all. While SAA faces significant tests, the broader archives profession also faces challenges. Sometimes these intersect and overlap, but not always. By joining SAA, you've already chosen a leadership position for the profession, and it is important to be knowledgeable about organizations and affiliated professions other than your own, and consider how decision-making and discussions can also affect non-SAA members. The first theme I would like to talk about is the value of the public record. Over the past 3 decades, there have been increasing pressures on the very concept of public records, something so key to the functioning of our American democracy. Secrecy and efforts to hide corruption and wrongdoing and fake news have been present in our political life dating back to the earliest days of the Republic. As we now live in a digital world, Many of our basic beliefs about what can be controlled in the creation or alteration of a record, its authenticity and very meaning are called into question. Preservation and access to the public record, whether you are a government records archivist or not, should be a concern to you as a citizen. The political spoils of our election system do have consequences on the historical record and have a direct impact on the efficacy of the archival enterprise. Current challenges for government archives sustainability include the overall shrinkage of governments and budget cuts for archives, the political appointments of individuals without archives experience or backgrounds, archives being subsumed by government bureaucracy and overwhelmed by unfunded mandates, and officials not understanding the role or importance of electronic records and digital preservation. Citizens still have ways to challenge and question records restrictions or destruction and protest open access, including FOIA requests, sunshine laws, and calls for public comment on appraisal decisions. Just 2 weeks ago, CREW, also known as the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, have brought Federal Records Act lawsuits against the EPA, filed a FOIA request with the State Department, and after filing a complaint with NARA, an investigation is underway to determine if the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services violated the law by deleting records of immigrant families split at the border. I would ask of you to serve as archives experts and responsible citizens to closely monitor your local archives, state archives, and SHRABs, and NARA. Be an advocate and stay informed. Write letters to the local newspapers and talk with your legislators and representatives about the importance of archives. There are advocacy publications and affordable webinars forthcoming from SAA. Use them. SAA and individual archivists have an important role to play as consistent and constant advocates. The second theme I would like to talk about is international human rights. I represented SAA at the International Council on Archives in Mexico City last fall, and I came to some conclusions about the importance of SAA's international activities. We have a major role to play in the American Hemisphere and world, not only as a role model, but also sharing resources such as disaster funding and developing collaborative projects which can impact archivists in multiple countries. Given our meeting location in Austin next year, I would propose a concerted effort to invite archivists from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean to join us and discuss both the questions and the possibilities. The documentation of human rights was also discussed. Past SAA president and former interim archivist of the United States, Trudy Peterson, reported on her work with Swiss Peace, an ICA effort to preserve and save records digitally in different geographic locations for protection purposes. They recently shared guiding principles for safe havens for archives at risk for comment from the archives community. Amnesty International is also announcing a project for the preservation of digital records. According to their press release, quote, "The new archive will accelerate investigations into human rights violations and protect digital records of significant historical importance to the global movement," unquote. It is important that we support this work and recognize that both activists and archivists play a role in ensuring the preservation and access to these records. Lastly, I would like to speak about allied memory organizations and professions. There are numerous communities comprising digital humanities, digital libraries, history, library, museum, and public history fields that overlap with the archives profession, which continue to expand and splinter. There is a distinct need to map these associated collection and memory professions and monitor their projects, grants, and research activities, which can also impact us. Based on what we hear from SAA members, affordability of our services is also a priority. Our perpetually low salaries, combined with a lack of financial support and an increasing number of competing conferences, puts pressure on professional development resources and limits how and when archivists can participate. In many ways, this cycle ensures that archivists working at larger institutions with funding will attend, have their voices heard, and gain connections and experience, whereas those at smaller institutions will be left out. Development and sustainability and inclusivity of all, especially of smaller repositories, remain questions. Later today, we will be meeting with representatives from the American Association for State and Local History, the Association for Moving Image Archivists, the Coalition for Networked Information, the Digital Library Federation, and RBMS, among others. We plan to discuss how we can better collaborate, how can we share information, and integrate the impact of our research, scholarly efforts, and understanding of current projects focusing on finding aid portals, data preservation, the linked data and metadata environments, website preservation, and user technology if we remain siloed. Finally, I want to conclude this presentation with some brief thoughts about your own leadership practice, as I believe this is where SAA truly has so much to offer each of you. Both SAA and the archives profession need you. It needs every one of you, your experience, your willingness to work hard, your perspective. Keep these things in mind as you write your own story. Be strategic and mindful about your archives career and service. Dedicate yourself to what you truly care about and are willing to spend the time on. Leaders are made, not born. Consider every experience you have as an important step on your path and as part of your individual story. Believe in yourself and share yourself with others. Smile and say hello to someone at this meeting you don't know. Share a story from your archives. Find a mentor. Be a mentor. When a colleague calls on you for advice, answer. Finally, I would also advise the following given how emotionally taxing our work can be at times. Remember why you do what you do. Take time for reflection and introspection about the complexity and depth of archives work. Take comfort in the friendship and support of your archives colleagues. Appreciate and feel the gratitude of your donors, no matter if they are individuals, offices, or agencies. Remember the integral role you play in creating the historical record. Be creative and strategic on how you accomplish your vocation. And here's my final thought. While archivists are about records, what we really are about is people. The people who created and saved the records, present, past, and future, and the people who want to use them to construct new narratives. Our mission is how can we best serve as thoughtful and dedicated intermediaries to ensure that their stories and lives are not forgotten. Thank you for sharing this time with me today.